So boxing promoters are now all working together, setting aside their differences and their egos as their very existence that dominated the sport is being threatened by TKO's Dana White and Turki Alashik. So now that TKO has officially entered the chat, traditional boxing promoters who normally have a very complicated relationship with each other are forced to work together and come up with exciting matches in hopes to keep boxing fans invested in them. Now, we all know TKO will launch this September with Canelo vs Crawford, a fight that is widely considered to be the biggest fight since Mayweather vs Pacquiao, and on top of that, it's free to watch to Netflix users across the globe at no additional cost. Obviously, Turkey's resources dwarfs that all of major boxing promoters combined. And it's quite evident as pretty much every big name fighter that you and I could think of has a cross deal with Turki Alashik alongside their existing contracts with their current promoters. Gervonta Tank Davis and David Benavidez are actually the only relatively known fighters who haven't signed yet with Turkey. Now, Golden Boy's Oscar De La Hoya recently confirmed that he's never been so happy to make phone calls with Matchroom's Eddie Hearn and PBC's Al Heyman, signifying that these guys are definitely working on something to make sure that they don't end up like the BlackBerry or Nokia when the iPhone first came out. Oscar De La Hoya was firm in his latest comments, saying that they're not going anywhere. However, personally, I feel like in order to compete with TKO's money and the fact that their big name fighters may eventually jump ships, these promoters must focus on their product quality, which includes building on exciting new talent and actually putting on a show. This could also mean investing more on the actual talent to organically grow their fan base just like back in the day. I mean, after all, Oscar De La Hoya himself is an example of a fighter who achieved great success and eventually became a household name because he himself is a good quality product of the sport. The Ring Magazine card last May 2nd that was held in Times Square was a prime example that popularity doesn't always mean premium quality. So with that being said, maybe, just maybe, it's now time to focus and give more importance to fighters who are making statements inside the ring and not on Twitter. Now, I hate to bring in professional wrestling in this conversation, but just hear me out on this one. If you grew up in the 90s and you watched wrestling as a kid, you probably are familiar with the Monday Night Wars between WCW and WWE. Now, by using these two as an example, think of WWE as the current promoters and WCW as TKO, which is ironic because TKO now owns WWE, but I digress. At that time, WWE introduced the big names like Hogan and Bret Hart. And when WCW became part of the conversation, they had a lot of money to spend, which attracted those names to eventually jump ships. Now, this led to the WWE with very little to no big name wrestlers. However, they pivoted into developing their bench players. So without going through excessive details, this move eventually resulted in the Attitude Era that brought in stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, DX, and forever giving the wrestling world a cultural footprint that would eventually change an entire industry and pop culture. Now, applying that same logic and with Cinco de Mayo as an example, again, we saw how quality outshined popularity. The Inoue vs Cardenas card? Sure, Inoue is relatively a big name, but that entire card was filled with a lot of not so popular fighters, with Ramon Cardenas himself literally being a DoorDash driver, and I'm not even saying that as a way to put him down, because there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm saying is that there's so many great fighters out there who aren't being given the chance or are simply ignored, and those fighters that you and I barely talk about, their card was the card that saved Cinco de Mayo. Now, I'm not vilifying TKO, Dana White, or Turki Alashik. I mean, after all, they just recently announced that they're dropping support for runners and will prioritize hungry and explosive fighters who can actually put on a show, signaling that they're also focused on producing good quality products. Now, in terms of the classic promoters and how they can compete with this, well, I think it's also by doing the same thing or even better. Like literally, just give the fans a great quality product. I know it's easier said than done and there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, but the fact that it took this long and Turkeyologic coming in for these promoters to start setting aside their pride and egos, well, don't you think that says a lot? Now, I'm not pro-classic promoter and anti-TKO, nor am I the other way around. I'm simply a boxing fan who wants to be entertained. And I'm still upset about how lame night 1 and 2 is of Cinco de Mayo. Mainly because I was hyping that shit up for months. Anyway, what are